Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Chris Andrew podcast. We're coming out a little bit later this week than anticipated. That's largely due to some unexpected emergencies with parenting, the very phenomenon I spoke so fondly of in last week's episode. If you haven't had a chance to listen, please jump on back and give it a crack. I was a bit wary to talk about it because I'm not particularly experienced, but from the generous feedback I've received from people who both have and don't have children, and also people who want and absolutely don't want children, it seemed like there was a lot of useful stuff there to share. So thank you so much. It was only fitting that the night that I released that episode, I got vomited on and woken up continuously. Maybe the largest amount of vomit I've ever experienced as a victim, at least. But it's a joy. It's all part of it. Today, pivoting to a different world entirely, back squarely in adult land, talking about the utility of constraints. And I've titled the episode The Freedom Paradox, but when calling it that, I see that Clive Hamilton's written a book of that exact topic. It's a case of overlapping nouns only. We're talking about quite different things. Where Clive Hamilton's talking about reconsidering freedom and morality in a neoliberal economic winning paradigm, I'm much more humbly and simply talking about having an awareness that in a situation where we do have pathways open to us in a lot of spheres compared to generations in the past, there still remains a great utility to constraint and to boundaries and to rules and borders and all these sorts of things, which are not necessarily virtuous in and of themselves, but are often seen as being limits that are undesirable. Whereas today I'm going to invite and explore the idea that no matter who you are and what environment you're in, it's probably the case that certain limits and constraints and guide rails are going to be desirable. And I'm not slowly nudging us towards embracing totalitarian rule or bringing in the full religious police or whatever you may think the worst excesses of that stuff are. I'm instead quite warm to the idea that we reckon with the environments that we're in more consciously than the environments themselves ask us to, and embrace the utility and comfort that having some constraints in how we go about our lives and choices can offer. Because we are measurably freer and more powerful, both individually and collectively, than in the past, but we are still equipped with both the biological and cultural tools that we use to navigate a very different world experience. So on the one hand, there's the risk that those tools, both biological and cultural, will be maladaptive and we crash and burn on the shores of the echoing chasms of all the power that we get. But on the other hand, there's the opportunity to consciously wield a few constraints, both individually and collectively, to make the most out of the present and coming world, to individually and collectively have a better time of it all. If that's a little abstract for you, don't go anywhere yet. We're going to have concrete examples and hopefully life-changingly useful conversation on the other side of the music. But before we get to that, thank you so much to my Patreon patrons for supporting the show and guiding the conversations that we do get to have. If you want to do either of those things, please jump on over to patreon.com/Andrew. There is a free tier, but of course, I really appreciate those of you who do give a small amount of whatever it is that you can to keep us up and running. Away we go. As I insinuated at the top there, we live in an era where many things that have been very limited to us through the entire history of our species have suddenly become basically limitless. There's a tweet that I saw years ago where somebody made the observation that if they had wanted to see a picture of an owl as a kid, they would have to go down to the library and get a book. Whereas now they're 2 seconds away from seeing a million owls. And obviously the same goes for basically any information you could crave. You right now listening to this are 2 seconds away from being able to learn how to build a bomb or I shouldn't have said that for algorithm purposes, but how to make the perfect creme brulee, send a letter to everybody that you've ever met, translate Lost Paradise into Japanese, or most likely see a satellite picture of the very spot that you're standing. These things are broadly amazing, but they come with all the costs in how they're packaged, obviously, but they're still wonders that if you had a light switch on the wall to turn it on or off into everybody's life, pretty much everybody would switch it on, I think. Certainly I benefit every time I have to Google how to change a car tire or whatever basic thing it is that I just have no idea how to do. I'm relieved that somebody's gone to all the effort of putting that stuff up But just as much as we fish out into that tide of an increasingly growing infinity of everything, it also inevitably washes back onto us via the channels that we access that stuff through, via our own unconscious desires where we pursue things that may not be in our best interest, whether that be the style of thing that we're accessing or the developmental paths that we rob ourselves of by taking the expedient path to information. But regardless, there's a limitless nature to both the amount of information that we can access and the way in which we access it that becomes its own stone around our necks. If you're anything like me, now and then you sit down at Google or YouTube or one of the portals into the world and think about what it is you actually want to look at, even just opening a web browser. I would say almost 100 times out of 100, I go to the same few websites by physical instinct rather than think about what is it out of all of the information in the world that I might want to access and what is the right way to do that, because things have become so frictionless that we can enjoy them before we even engage our frontal cortex. And again, that's great not to have barriers between you and the things you might want to pursue. But at the same time, there's a selection paralysis where if you are sitting in front of the entire world's ocean, which cup do you think is going to be the most interesting or of utility to you? It's kind of hard to know. And we also don't have the cultural scripts for how to determine that stuff. And that's another key element of how things have become limitless. We're also living at a time where the weight of cultural expectation, the weight of cultural requirements, the certain utility of known paths is massively diluted. For many of us, it's totally exploded. Also for many of us, I should say, it still exists as before, but its utility is certainly not as obvious. Study really hard, do a university course that's successful, and then get a job and you'll be set up for life. That's not true anymore. Get married while you're young and you'll have a partner for life. That's not true anymore. You go to church and you'll have good moral clarity around your life. I mean, none of these things are necessarily true ever, but as I talked about in the episode on cultural lag, the predictive utility in any of these ideas is much, much lower than it used to be. And so with cultural rules relaxed, or at least certainly not as uniform, and with a few frontiers where the limits have gone from 10 to 10 zillion, it becomes incumbent upon us to have a conscious engagement with how we place constraints and limitations in how we navigate those oceans. And that's not easy. In most ways, we're the first generations along all these frontiers. And so there aren't the cultural scripts and there aren't the obvious consequences of seeing what it looks like to fail or succeed drastically in navigating this stuff that are at hand for everybody to see. You don't need me to tell you that we're obviously a herd species and we're very dependent upon and influential upon each other. But even that itself is a difficult one at a time where we're influenced by other people and need modeling to be able to navigate the uncharted waters a little more. Even finding role models themselves is a bit tricky. And a big part of this is just that we can access so many more lives at a great distance in much greater detail. A level of detail that can make you feel like you understand them sometimes, but you're still accessing them through the panopticon. So it can be very difficult at times to determine the degree of misery that someone you really admire is experiencing, or the happiness that someone you loathe is experiencing. And the more we access that stuff, the more inevitably with our monkey brains, we're comparing them to our own lives and having our own status reactions to hierarchies, etc. And it's not clear what percentage of everybody's joy in attaining their own goals is robbed by being able to have at hand instant examples of people that are doing exponentially better in your same stated goals. And increasingly, as there's a higher percentage of those sort of interactions creeping into your consciousness versus the real world ones, you're missing huge swathes of very important information about what small victories may look like in people's lives that are difficult to capture via that lens. Little moments of stillness and silence, or whatever it might be, just quiet reflections, moments of calm. All of humanity's good graces are synthesized in one form or another in the digital realm, but inevitably they lose something, particularly when they can only be captured performatively. But also the wholeness of those experiences isn't captured or communicated at the moment, but we still are making our unconscious assessments and interactions against that information as though it is whole, which is quite a distortive mirror. And that distorted mirror has always existed, but it's kind of this uncanny valley that we're in at the moment where instead of being able to make mistakes about a few people at a big distance, we can do it across a large swathe of people and with much more information, but still critically incomplete information, which I think really distorts how we're able to assess what's worth doing or not doing, or how we're going or how other people are going, or collectively how we're going. That's increasingly not the case, as we have had now a couple of spins through some cycles of people experiencing and interacting with this world. We have a better sense of what the worst failures can be. We all know what cyberbullying is, or phone addiction, or porn addiction, or we have a baseline understanding that it's not a good idea to compare yourself to everyone that you see online. We know what sort of behaviors that we see online that may be performatively successful, betray individual distress, or whatever it might be. But that horizon is moving back so quickly that whatever questions you may think you have solved for how to use Web 2.0 might be rendered completely useless by the time you are dealing with whatever the next generation of AI interfaces is going to present to us. And I should say, whilst it's most obvious in tech realms because of the exponential nature of the growth and change, it's still a phenomenon that exists in the strictly material world, where the amount of wealth, access to resources, food, networked societies and everything has changed in a way that I think is hard for us to get our heads around. In fact, maybe this is a good chance to share a page that was sent to me by a listener, Gus, from a book, The Secret Life of Groceries. He said it resonated with a couple of the episodes he'd been listening to in the last months. I'm quoting here from the book. Around the War of 1812, nearly 90% of the population worked to produce the nation's food. It was a grueling physical life, and in addition to being costly, the food produced was of uneven quality, in tightly limited supply, and could and did kill through disease. Now, less than 3% of our population produces enough food to feed us all. We spend less of our money on food, and we spend less time gathering that food than at any time in history. So within a century, we've cut the rates of hunger and nutritional deficiency to historic lows, reduced foodborne illness to a rounding error, and democratized food that was once the height of luxury into fare for everyday consumption. And we've been so successful in all those endeavors that we now grapple with a series of problems entirely unprecedented in the history of humanity, of too much food, of using food to distribute ethical responsibility, of food as proxy for control in our own increasingly detached lives. Okay, so thank you, Gus, for sending that in. That's obviously just one of many domains in which the way in which wealth has increased in the recent century has upended our lives. And aside from the mechanical changes that makes to your life of having the luxury to pursue more things, it's not surprising that there would be an increase in a kind of selection anxiety and a decision paralysis as we stand in front of worlds of opportunity that didn't exist to our ancestors. I don't need to pick up the same plow my father picked up because my father didn't have a plow. His father didn't have a plow. You got to go back a while until not only did your father have a plow and his father have a plow, but you'd better pick it up. Otherwise, everyone in your house is going to starve. I mean, I'm being a little bit reductive, but a reminder, 1812, nearly 90% of the population worked to produce the nation's food. And food is obviously something you can't go without. But now as the constraints of hunger and wealth and other kinds of access to resources disappear, and at the same time as our access to information, opportunities, connections has just skyrocketed to the stratosphere, it's not all necessarily easy pickings. In fact, again, it's unsurprising that people would be anxious in response to this because where in the past we had a comfort and certainty of the paths that we should live and the lives that we should lead, now we have to answer those questions for ourselves. And I think I can't overstate how much of a loosening of the reins that is. I mean, again, a few generations ago, it wouldn't even have been a question what you were going to do on your Sunday morning. Whereas now, my Sunday mornings are different every single week. And I wouldn't reasonably expect my peers to be doing the same thing as me at a particular given time of the week. And that changes how you structure your own life and society. So all of these little and big disillusions call for us to consciously engage with which constraints we use to put in place of those that have gone from the past, because whatever borders exist can and will define whole swathes of all of our lives. And we don't want to just be inheriting them from other people or inheriting them from whatever systems happen to wash before us. You might not know this, but one of the hats I've worn in my professional life is musician. And something that comes up for me again and again in the people that I collaborate with is a clear pattern where those who have learnt the most, spent the most time learning scales, spend the most time mastering other people's pieces, have the capacity to achieve great complexity in what they do. Very often when you sit down with those people at a piano, it's an inverted capacity where they feel the least able to simply come up with something. They've spent all their time growing the colors of the palette that they can paint with, that when it's time to sit down and pick one, there's a paralysis that comes where there's a fear to make sure that you're not choosing the wrong ones. That's a stereotype in my experience of playing with classically trained musicians. But then on the other hand, there's the jazz musicians who have the same type of situation with a different flavor, which is they've mastered all the notes and all the scales and how to be open and come up with everything. But once you have all these high level skills, it becomes much harder to sit down and to do something very simple. Whereas in many instances, the simplest thing may be exactly what is called for, or maybe the best. I think there's any number of examples that you can probably come to hand in your own life where having the maximum amount of resources or having a growing limit distorts your capacity to make a choice, whereas reckoning with a constraint might make a superior choice. For example, if you've got 10 grand in the bank and you've got 2 weeks off, you might think, oh, well, I should go to Italy or Japan and see the world because that's the best way to enjoy my time and that money. But that might not be the case at all. You might be much happier just sitting at home, hanging out with the people that you love the most, or I mean, whatever. You also might be happier doing. This isn't about not going to Japan or Italy. That also may be the optimal option, but it's the same with, I've talked about this before, if you get 99 in your university entrance score, very rarely do people get that score and then choose to become a mechanic. They think, oh, I should maximize that and be a dentist or a doctor. Whereas maybe you'd be happier as a mechanic, or maybe you'd make more money, or whatever it is. When people go to buy a house, they'll typically borrow to the maximum threshold of whatever amount it is that they can get, and get a house for that. Whereas if you look at, I don't know, if I look at my parents' generation, I think if the house was even 75% of the size with, half the garden size or whatever, would they be radically less happy? I doubt it, but they may have a lot more resources to be able to do other things in their life that may be of greater utility. There does seem to be something about having increased capacity and increased resources and more colors on that palette that does make it harder to navigate life effectively. One of my favorite artists is the White Stripes, and they very explicitly, from the start, Jack White had a conceptual framework that was much more limiting than other musicians go for, especially given how good he is as a guitarist. For him, there's this mythical rule of three, which is just more of a vague guideline than an actual law. He says that he's drawn inspiration from the De Stijl art movement, which is simple colors in stripes and blocks. And in the same way, he takes the simple elements of songwriting and he puts constraints kind of everywhere in their practice where other artists try to expand and have fewer constraints. So, for example, he would just book a couple of days of studio time and force them to write and finish the album in that period. He would not bring in a bass guitar despite every other band having that register covered off in that way. He's playing with his first wife, then ex-wife, Meg White, who chances are is not as conventionally good as a drummer that's in your social circle. They would only wear red, white, and black. They wouldn't have set lists at their live shows. He wouldn't have backup guitars for when his guitar goes out of tune. Just all these sort of small obstacles, constraints and barriers. But what that as a collective meant for them was a clear aesthetic, and they're able to punch the effort into using the tools that they have to get the maximum out of that. And I think it really shows. You don't have to be a White Stripes fan to concede that they were very successful. And if you are a fan like me, then there's something about everything being so on the edge and even, in conventional sense, not good, that makes it much more magical than if everything was written and played perfectly to a metronome or that years of effort had gone into each song. There's something that gets lost in that trade-off. So it's clear here that it's the constraints themselves that define not only the flavor and style of what the project is, but the quality and the capacity for it to be great that exists at all. And it's kind of counterintuitive because they're robbing huge swathes of the tools that other people use to achieve greatness and in that limited palette, then able to achieve their own form of greatness. And whatever it is in your own life, I'm sure that you're better off consciously choosing because only you ultimately know what you want to get out of certain things or what you want certain situations, goals, environments to feel like for you. But it's not just in the more abstract worlds of music and the arts that this type of principle can apply. I was very fortunate to have a coaching session with an elite Australian performance coach, Dave Diggle. And in that session, me being me, rather than focus on how I could improve at any of the things I was trying to do, I was inevitably pivoting to talking about the principles of his world and what his experiences were that were interesting to him. And at that time, he'd been working with an emerging champion kickboxer or taekwondo, I can't remember, but someone who's in the martial arts. And this guy, they'd noticed a trend where he would always come out and either lose immediately or certainly win. So Dave was trying to get to the heart of what was occurring with this guy. And he realized that this guy was so skilled and had all this stuff going on in his head, all these punches he could throw, kicks he could throw, counters, etc., etc., etc. But like so many things in life, the challenge is to be present in the exact moment. And his awareness of all the things he could be doing was taking him away from that. And so Dave just gave him the simple challenge of, okay, before you go out, I want you to decide for yourself, this is the first punch and this is the first kick that I'm going to throw. Regardless of the situation, that's it. And the next tournament he went in, he won everything. I think this is a perfect example to use as a metaphor in understanding how to navigate uncertainty in our own life. I know for me, I have struggled and still struggle with what to do with my time because there's so many things I like to do, but also I'm lucky. There's so many things I'm interested in and feel like I can do to some threshold level. And it becomes a paralysis where I do nothing usefully. Whereas if you go out and just have that one punch and that one kick, maybe you can navigate something more effectively and at least do well at whatever it is you spend your time doing. Now, what do classical musicians and kickboxers got to do with picking a career or what to do with the weekend or how we maintain our friendships or how we pick our hobbies? It's the same principle. You need to pick your punch, your kick, you need to pick your color palette, whatever it is, and run with it. And that doesn't mean that you can't go back and assess whether that's been useful or not. I think that is the most important thing that gives you the freedom. I think you can't have the freedom to commit to doing something with full confidence without knowing also that you have the capacity to evaluate it and to switch it up as you need to. But the degree to which we need to reckon with how we place constraints on ourselves and consciously engaging with how we choose to walk through the growing spheres of infinity are both harder and more important than ever. I think what you even would speculate would be the obvious costs of failing to do that well are something that we see everywhere. The rising tide of people reporting anxiety, people losing meaning, people not engaging with conventional lives. I know I said I'm not talking about the same things as Clive Hamilton in his book, and I haven't actually read it, but I did see this quote from it. Freed from want, discrimination, and oppression, we huddle together like sheep seeking one another's comfort after the fences have been taken down, habituated to the domesticated life and fearful of what lies beyond. That stuff's starting to come back in feedback waves. And I think that's what's driving much of the revival of cultural concepts that I naively thought we would never really see again, like trad wife movements, youth conservatism, trad mask discourse, a whole bunch of cultural ideas that seem to, very much to me to be a reaction to how frightening the echoing cavern of letting go of everything in the past can be. And these examples at their extremes are very easy to hand maps for how to navigate things, whilst they might retain aesthetic links and the utilities of shorthand choice architecture in that you don't need to interrogate every decision you make to make good ones. The fact that the world around is still completely exploded means that they're unlikely to have the same flavor or offer up the same experiences as they did as lifestyles in the past. In fact, it's far more likely that as freedom and the power to choose what you do with your life increases, we're going to see situations of Amish Luddites sitting on the bus. Shame on you, Amish Luddites. You shouldn't be on the bus. Walking down the street next to, I don't know, whatever your hyper example is of furries or whatever. And I've unfairly picked on people who skew conservative there. But of course, there's just as much scrambling for certainty and meaning from people who are higher in trade openness. And I think that's what drives the last decade or so's obsession with identity politics, where we're constantly defining, redefining, placing, sorting, understanding, categorizing how people are based on particular categories and obsessing over the shorthand reductive elements rather than looking to engage with the wholeness of people or to just accept that everyone can be whatever, that's fine. And assuming that we can control the interactions of how X category navigates the world and that we should. These sorts of obsessions and fixations are another attempt, I think, to wield control at the foundational level to assert that there is a control of the understanding of the things like the nature of humanity, etc. But then also subsequently how we should navigate that stuff in building our societies. That's I think that's another response to this sort of growing abyss, and an equally unhelpful one because again, it's not based on whole realities and inevitably excludes important information in understanding how to navigate the world. And the fact that there is even a divide there, I think is interesting to explore. We've got a pretty good understanding now that people do tend to skew either to have the traits that end up with them being defined conservative or liberal as sort of inherent personality traits. So there are correlations between high trade openness and an appetite for new ideas. Obviously, that's correlated to being progressive. And I think neuroticism and conscientiousness trend more to conservatism. And I think it's broadly tough for everybody because instead of just knowing the actual people down at your football club or at your workplace or your pub or whatever that might be a bit different to you, you now can be exposed to the worst hyper examples of the extreme opposite of you in fora where they're extremely successful and also they have millions of acolytes following them. And I mean, what could that be but alienating? And of course, rather than knowing these people and being able to have humanizing disagreements or the positive interrelations that you would have in real life, as well as the arguments and disagreements, you don't get the chance. I've been lucky through my time in the public sphere to many times meet people that I thought that I would detest, that I felt were at the polar opposite of humanity to me. And I've always been struck because I'm generally, I would say, outlier motivated to get on with people and like getting on with people. And I'm always shocked how these people that I assume would be despicable to me, once you find your common points of humanity, are actually a lot more fun to me than many other people that I know. And yeah, I had a couple of those shocks even recently, and it's a wonderful one to get. But if you're not in a lot of spheres bumping around to people, and you're not, at the millionth percentile of extroversion like me, you might not get to have those experiences. And then it can be very hard to understand why people are navigating the world differently to you. I raise these differences in how we tend to split. Firstly, to advocate the idea that if we're going to have large societies and open societies, we need to be able to place constraints into how we navigate that stuff for our well-being so that we can tolerate the existence of extreme otherness without needing to turn to violent words or violent deeds. But also to understand that people of those different temperaments will have different preferences in the constraints that they will need to have in navigating the world. So just as much as important to tolerate difference, it is important to find like-minded people and to get a sense of how people that are like you in your preferences and navigational systems are able to put constraints and thrive, because that great abyss, it shows a different threatening face to everybody. You don't really need to look too far to see how the same constraints wear differently upon all of us based on what we're like. I mean, where some people won't feel comfortable outside of a monogamous relationship, some people will be in a marriage and miserable with the constraints that entails for decades. And similarly, some people are perfectly happy to sit at a desk and do rote work, and other people, if they're forced to do it, they lash out in other ways. It's all about listening to yourself and finding the constraints that work for you. And as such, it's important to be wary of one-size-fits-all answers that are out there, because they sure are out there, and they're much more effective and popular and easy to peddle than the idea that everyone should calibrate their own life against a series of ongoing tests and being present and making mistakes and whatever else. It's less sexy to write a book on that stuff than it is to say, here's what everyone's doing wrong and here's how you charm others and here's how you manifest what you want or whatever it is. Whether positive or negative freedom, as a concept, it presents and invokes the idea that everything's available for you to do. And perhaps more than ever, that is the case. With a bit of work, you could probably live anywhere. You could start to pursue more things than before. But when intersecting with reality, of course, you can't do everything. By definition, the selection of any path or choice is the exclusion of many, many others, if not all of them. The real obvious danger is obviously the portals that we use to access different information, whether it's the algorithmic-driven social media or search engines, or even just picking up your phone or using a computer. There are already strict valences with design principles that very strongly guide how you will end up using those products. There's huge pitfalls to fall into, but also huge dividends to be gained by using constraints and barriers to navigate that stuff properly. And it's my impression that much of that conversation surrounds a sort of baseline bare minimum of like, don't take your phone into bed with you, or buy the brick product so you don't use your phone in particular hours or whatever it is. That could be really important to you. But I think at a larger level, there's also an opportunity to, separate to just tech stuff, navigate your life and reality in a way that allows you to maximize the things that you want to be doing and minimize the things that you want to avoid, much more than I think many of us take the time to calibrate, again, just because of the infinite size of those spheres these days. And a lot of it is just out of your control. As I said, with the tech stuff, there's only so much that you on your own can do to design a better mobile phone for you to hold in your hand that can do all the things you want and also avoid the things that you don't want to be doing with it. I used the example a few episodes ago of all the varieties of ketchup and tomato sauce in a supermarket. If I could choose a supermarket that only had one or two varieties of every single thing I wanted and it was a tenth of the size, I would. But it's hardly within my control to do that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't hundreds of small things that you can do to curate your daily life to be much more sharply focused on maximizing the things that you do want to have. I don't know what comes to mind, but there's that stupid example of Mark Zuckerberg. He, early on in his career as an extremely successful CEO, he talked about only wearing the same clothes every day because it was one less decision that he needed to make from the decision fatigue of being a hotshot and thinking about things all the time. That is a real interesting intervention for him. He decided he doesn't care about what he wears or what he looks like. No surprises there. So instead of having a cupboard full of a million clothes, he's just got the one thing. Easy. Boom. That's great. In my episode on brain rot, I talked about, I'm referencing a lot of former episodes today, which makes me think I'm really building a body of work. In my episode back on brain rot, which I recommend you listen to, I talk about how the cognitive connections that you make with your work when writing by pen are stronger than when you type. And so consequently, you remember the material much better. That's then an easy one. If you're a writer or a musician or a student or whatever it is, if you have the opportunity, make the conscious choice to close your laptop, open up a physical book, pen and paper, and to start writing, you're going to have a stronger engagement with whatever it is that you're doing and to retain information better. Having an awareness of choosing your environment consciously is thus so important and such a powerful tool that you get to have. Jonathan Franzen, who of course wrote the book on freedom, he, when writing his fictions, goes away and lives without the internet for months. This style of creating creative work in particular has long been known, that relationship between the environment and the work that you create. But it doesn't have to be about creating creative works. It's just also about the life you live. There are conscious ways in which you can put little constraints up by moving certain things from your environment that will radically change how you engage with the space. That's what writers' retreats are. I mean, I've been on plenty of music retreats myself, and they're always away from where you are, from where you live most of your life, because there are all these small unconscious behaviors that you do day to day, even just in how you navigate choosing where to eat or how you get out of the house, that can inhibit your ability to be present. Because if you're running on an autopilot, it's hard to be sitting in the environment, listening to whatever your emotional state is and allowing whatever music it is or a collaboration opportunity with the people that are in front of you to emerge. And this is something that we all know. I think most people appreciate the joy of going away for a couple of days and coming back refreshed, or we register how nice it is to get a new perspective on something by being in a new physical space or getting into nature in a new way. But the benefits of these types of phenomena can and should exist in your day-to-day, at least by consciously structuring the environments that you go in and how you spend your time, because both your physical space and your time can more than ever just be clogged by that backwash of infinite opportunities, infinite information, infinite requests, infinite needs, infinite things that you could be doing with your time. It very, very quickly clogs all the gears, and it can be hard to clear out the barnacles and create the space to think about what is it that I actually enjoy or what is it that I'm trying to do, etc., etc. So I guess the obvious question is, how should we in our own lives look at how we set up those constraints, knowing that we're all completely different and in different environments and seeking different things? Just a quick scan, I think it could be really useful to conceive of them as informational ones, where you control the environment of what information you receive, whether it be social, news of the world, stuff to do with your career, how you read books, watch content, whatever it is. I hope by now it's beyond obvious what the utility of that is and how important it is and how massively just a few conscious constraints could frame your next decade, ones that I wish I'd put in place a decade ago. Behavioral constraints are obviously worth looking at your own behavior, because everybody does different things that they wish that they weren't doing or would like to do more of certain things, and how you consciously tinker with your life to put in constraints to make sure that you can do more of the things that you like and hopefully radically fewer of the ones that you don't want to be doing. Easy to say. Easy to say, but there are decisions that you can make that will make a big difference with that stuff. Your aspirations, I think, how you conceive of the goals, the things that you want to do, the things that you're striving towards, etc. Even just articulating them is already a constraint on how you spend your imagination space. But having a conscious engagement with structuring those so that they are anchored towards what you find to be most satisfying. That could be a hugely easy win and sometimes low-hanging fruit, because as many of us go through life sort of with a vague idea of what it is we want to be doing, but if you're just spending 5 minutes consciously articulating it can make a big difference. And perhaps one of the most important ones, I think, for well-being is put constraints on your expectations of others. I find that I'm daily, because of my own constitution, surprised at how much misery other people seem to be experiencing because they have expectations of others to be other than they are, or to need to be something in particular. Whether it's people in your immediate sphere or people you've never heard of, it's impossible not to have social reactions to information about people. And there's a lot of misery that could be born from requiring other people to be a certain way when it's something that you broadly, almost universally, have zero control over. But these are all things that I could go into a lot more in a subsequent episode if there is interest. For my Patreon patrons this week, I'm going to do some extra content where I go into the constraints that I are actively putting in or looking to put in my own life and how they're going, just because I think it could be a fun extra journey. If that's appealing to you, jump on over to patreon.com/Andrew. And thank you so much to those who have already contributed and joined. I couldn't appreciate you more. Everybody, go out there, have a great week, and I look forward to speaking to you again in a few days. Speak soon.